Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this live stream for Windows Server 2003. So I just want to share my screen. Okay, using remote access policies. Windows Server 2003 includes support for two additional configuration systems, remote access policies and remote access profiles. We'll look at remote access profiles in the section using remote access profiles later in this chapter. Policies determine who may and may not connect. You define rules with conditions that the system evaluates to see whether a particular user can connect or not. You manage remote access policies through the Remote Access Policies folder in the RRAS snap-in. Policies contain conditions that you pick from a list when a caller connects. The policy's conditions are evaluated one by one to see whether the caller gets in or not. All of the conditions in the policy must match for the user to gain access. If there are multiple policies, they're evaluated according to an order you specify. In the following sections, you will see how to create and configure remote access policies. Creating a new policy. To create a new policy, right-click the Remote Access Policies folder and select New Remote Access Policy. This command starts the new Remote Access Policy wizard, which uses a series of steps to help you define the policy. You use the policy configuration method page to tell the wizard if you want to configure a custom or a built-in policy and define a friendly name for the policy. This is the name that appears in the snap-ins policy list. So see here figure 8.2, the policy configuration method of the new remote access policy wizard. If you choose to configure a custom policy, the policy conditions page will be next. This page will initially be blank. To create a condition for the policy, click the Add button, which will bring up the Select Attribute dialog box. So you can see here figure 8.3, the conditions page for the new remote access policy wizard, and figure 8.4, the Select Attribute dialog box. The Select Attribute dialog box lists all of the attributes that you can evaluate in a policy. See table 8.1. Okay, so we'll just move on here. There's no need to read all this. So once you choose an attribute and click the Add button, its corresponding editor appears with this editor. You can edit the value of the attribute. For example, if you select the day and time restrictions attribute, you'll see the time of day constraints dialog box, which is a calendar grid that lets you select which days and times are available for logging in. Each attribute has its own unique editor. After you select an attribute and give it a value, you can add more attributes or move to the next page by clicking the next button on the policy conditions page. The permissions page of the wizard has only two radio buttons, which specify whether the policy you create allows or prevents users from connecting, grant remote access permissions, or deny remote access permissions. Once you choose a permission and right-click the next, the profile page appears. The Edit Profile button allows you to edit the user profile attached to the policy. You don't have to edit the profile. When you create the policy, you can always come back to it later. Once you create a policy, it will appear in the snap-in and you can manage it independently of all other policies. So in exercise 8.1, you'll create an adjunct policy that adds time and day restrictions to the default policy. This exercise requires you to be in Windows 2000 native or Server 2003 domain function level, and you must have completed the exercise in chapter 7. So creating a remote access policy. 1. Open the RRAS MMC snap-in by selecting Start Administrative Tools, Routing and Remote Access. 2. Expand the server you want to configure in the left pane of the MMC. 3. Select the Remote Access Policies folder. 4. Select Action. New Remote Access Policy. The new Remote Access Policy wizard starts. Click next to dismiss the welcome page and continue with the wizard. 5. On the Policy Configuration Method page, select the Set Up a Custom Policy radio button. Type working hours and restriction in the policy name field and then click the next button. 6. On the Policy Conditions page, click the Add button. The Select Attributes dialog box appears. 7. Select the day and time restrictions attribute and then click the Add button. 8. The time of day constraints dialog box appears. Use the calendar control to allow remote access through Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and then click the OK button. 9. The conditions page reappears, this time with the new condition listed. Click the next button. 10. The permissions page appears. Select the Grant Remote Access Permission radio button and click next to continue. 11. The user profile page appears. Click the next button. You'll edit the profile in the next exercise. 12. Click the finish button on the confirmation screen to close the wizard and save your changes. Working with existing profiles. After you complete exercise 8.1, you'll be better equipped to see a couple of additional policy management features. To begin, you can reorder policies by right-clicking a policy in the MMC window and selecting Move Up and Move Down, because policies are evaluated in order of their appearance in the snap-in and because all conditions of all policies must match for a user to get access. This is a good way to establish a set of policies that filter out some users. For example, you could create one policy that only allows members of the marketing department to dial in between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. and then add another that allows engineers free rein to dial in anytime. In addition, when you open the Policies Properties dialog box, you can add to and remove them from the policy, change the policy's name, and control whether a user whose connection matches the policy's conditions will be granted or denied access. In addition, you delete a policy you no longer need by right-clicking on it and using the delete command. The snap-in will prompt you for confirmation before it removes the policy. So you can see here, figure 8.5, the policy properties dialog box. Using remote access policies. Remote access profiles are an integral part of remote access policies. Profiles contain settings that determine what happens during call setup and completion. Don't confuse remote access profiles with the dial-in settings associated with a user profile. Each policy has a profile associated with it. The profile determines what settings will be applied to connections that meet the conditions stated in the policy. For security reasons, it's usually a good idea to limit access to the administrative accounts on your network. In particular, we usually tell clients to restrict remote access for the administrator account. In this way, the potential exposure from a dial-up compromise is somewhat reduced. In exercise 8.2, you will learn how to configure the administrator's accounts user profiles to restrict dial-up access. So 1. Log onto your computer using an account that has administrative privileges. 2. If you're using an RRAS server that's part of an AD domain, open the Active Directory users and computer snap by selecting Start Administrative Tools, Active Directory users and computers. If not, open the local users group snap-in by selecting Start Administrative Tools, Local Users and Groups. 3. Expand the tree to the users folder. Right-click the administrator account in the right-hand pane and choose Properties. The administrator's properties dialog box appears. 4. Switch to the Dial-In tab on machines that participate in Active Directory. The control access to remote access policy radio button in the permissions group should be set. 5. Click the deny radio button to prevent the use of this account over a dialing connection. 6. Click OK. You can create one profile for each policy, either when you create the policy or later by using the Edit Profile button in the Policy Properties dialog box. The profile contains settings that fit into 6 distinct areas. Each area has its own tab in the Profile Properties dialog box. These tabs include the Dial-In Constraints tab, the IP tab, the Multi-Link tab, the Authentication tab, the Encryption tab, and the Advanced tab. The Dial-In Constraints tab. The Dial-In Constraints tab has most of the settings that you think of when you consider dial-in access controls. The controls here allow you to adjust how long the connection may be idle before it gets dropped, how long it can be up, the dates and times for establishing the connection, and what dial-in port the medium can be used to connect. So you can see here figure 8.6, the Dial-In Constraints tab of the Edit Dial-In Profile Properties dialog box. The IP tab. The IP tab gives you control over the IP related settings associated with an incoming call. If you think back to the server specific settings covered in the previous chapter, you remember that the server preferences include settings for other protocols besides IP. This is not so in the remote access profile. In the remote access profile, you can specify where the client gets its IP address. As a bonus, you can define IP packet filters that screen out particular types of traffic to and from the client. So you can see here figure 8.7, the IP tab of the Edit Dial-In The IP tab of the Edit Dial-In Profile Properties dialog box. The Multi-Link tab. The profile mechanism gives you a degree of control over how the server handles multi-link calls. You exert this control through the multi-link tab on the Profile Properties dialog box. Your first choice is to decide whether to allow them at all, and if so, how many ports you want to allow a single client to use at once. Normally, this setting is configured so that the server-specific settings take precedence, but you can override them. Figure 8.8, the Multi-Link tab of the Edit Dial-In Profile Properties dialog box. The Bandwidth Allocation Protocol BAP settings control group gives you a way to control what happens during a multi-link call when the bandwidth usage drops below a certain threshold. For example, why tie up 3 analog lines to provide 168 kbps of bandwidth when the connection is using only 56 kbps. You can tweak the capacity and time thresholds by default. A multi-link call will drop 1 line every minute. The bandwidth usage falls below 50% of the available bandwidth and stays there for 2 minutes. They require BAP for a dynamic multi-link request checkbox allows you to refuse calls from clients that don't support BAP. This is an easy way to make sure that no client can hog your multi-link bandwidth. The Authentication tab. On the Authentication tab, you can specify which authentication methods are allowed on this specific policy. Note that these settings, like the other policy settings, will be useful only if the server's settings match. For example, if you turn EAP authentication off in the server properties dialog box, turning it on in the Authentication tab of the Profile Properties dialog box will have no effect. So you can see here figure 8.9, the Authentication tab of the Edit Dial-In Profile Properties dialog box. You'll notice each authentication method has a checkbox. Check the appropriate boxes to control the protocols that you want this profile to use. If you enable EAP, you can also choose which specific EAP type you want the profile to support. You can also choose to allow totally unauthenticated access, which is unchecked by default. The encryption tab. The encryption tab controls which type of encryption you want your remote users to have access to. The following radio buttons are listed on the encryption tab. Basic encryption MPPE 40-bit means single DES data encryption standard for IPsec, or 40-bit Microsoft point-to-point encryption MPPE for point-to-point tunneling protocol PPTP. Strong encryption MPPE 56-bit means 56-bit encryption single DES for IPsec, 56-bit MPPE for PPTP. Strongest encryption MPPE 128-bit means triple DES for IPsec, or 128-bit MPPE for PPTP connections. No encryption allows users to connect using no encryption at all. When unchecked, a remote connection must be encrypted or it'll be rejected. So exercise 8.3, open the RRAS snap-in by selecting Start Administrative Tools, Routing and Remote Access. 2. Expand the server you want to configure in the left pane of the MMC. 3. Select the Remote Access Policies folder. The right pane of the MMC displays the policies defined for this server. Select the working hours restrictions policy you created in exercise 8.1. 4. Select action properties. The policy properties dialog box appears. 5. Click the edit profile button. The edit dial-in profile dialog box appears. Select the encryption tab. 6. Uncheck the no encryption checkbox. Make sure that the basic, strong, and strongest if present checkboxes are all marked. 7. Click the OK button. When the policy properties dialog box reappears, click the OK button. The Advanced tab. The Advanced tab is primarily used if you want your RRAS server to interoperate with Radius equipment from other vendors. The tab allows you to specify additional attributes you want incorporated into the profile. Figure 8.11, the Advanced tab of the Edit Dial-in Profile Properties dialog box. When you first open the tab, you'll see only 2 attributes specified: service type with a value of framed, and framed protocol with a value of PPP. That combination allows the RRAS server to tell its peers that it's handling a framed PPP connection. There are several dozen additional attributes available, and each can be added with the add button. Some are defined in the Radius standard, while others are specific to particular vendors. It's not necessary to know what attributes are on this list, only that you use the Advanced tab to add additional attributes when combining RRAS with third-party Radius-based solutions. Setting up a VPN access policy. Earlier in this chapter, you learned how to use the remote access policy mechanism on a Windows Server 2003 native domain. Now it's time to apply what you learned to a virtual private network, VPN. Recall that there are 2 ways to control which specific users can access a remote access server. You can grant and deny dialog permission to individual users in each user's properties dialog box, or you can create a remote access policy that embodies whatever restrictions you want to impose. It turns out that you do the same thing for VPN connections, but there are a few additional things considered. to consider granting or deny per user access. To grant or deny VPN access to individual users, all you have to do is make the appropriate change on the dial-in tab of each user's properties dialog box. Although this is the easiest method to understand, it gets tedious quickly if you need to change VPN permissions for more than a few users. Furthermore, there's no way to distinguish between dial-in and VPN permission. Creating a remote access policy for VPNs. You may find it helpful to create remote access policies that enforce the permissions you want end users to have. There are a number of ways to accomplish this result. Which one you use will depend on your overall use of remote access policies. The simplest way is to create a policy that allows all your users to use a VPN. Earlier in this chapter, you learned how to create remote access policies to specify settings for them. One thing you may have noticed was there's an NAS port type attribute that you can use in the policies condition. That attribute is the cornerstone of building a policy that allows or denies remote access via VPN, because you use it to accept or reject connections arriving over a particular type of VPN connection. For best results, you'll use tunnel type in conjunction with the NAS port type attribute as described in exercise 8.4. So creating a VPN remote access policy. 1. Open the RRAS MMC console by selecting Start, Administrative Tools, Routing and Remote Access. 2. Navigate to the server on which you want to create the policy and expand the server node until you see the Remote Access Policies node. 3. Right-click the Remote Access Policies folder and choose the new Remote Access Policy command. This starts the new Remote Access Policy wizard. 4. Name the policy VPN access or something else that clearly indicates what it's for, and then click the next button. 5. When the policy conditions page of the wizard appears, click the Add button to add this condition. NAS port type attribute set to virtual VPN. If you want to restrict VPN users to either PP, TP, or L2TP, add this other condition. Tunnel type attribute set to the appropriate control. Click the next button. 6. In the permissions page of the wizard, make sure the Grant Remote Access Permission radio button is selected unless you're trying to prevent VPN users from connecting. Click the next button. 7. The profile page appears next. If you want to create a specific profile, perhaps restrict which authentication types VPN clients may use the Edit Profile button to specify the new profile. At a minimum, you should clear the No Encryption option on the Encryption tab of the Remote Access profile. When you're done editing the profile, click the Next button, then click the Finish button to create and activate the policy. If you don't want to grant VPN access to everyone, there are some changes you can make to the process in exercise 8.4 to fine-tune it. When you add the policy described in this exercise, it will end up at the end of the policy list. This means that the default policies will take effect before the VPN policy does. So you'll probably want to move the VPN policy to the top of this list. For example, if you want to allow everyone dial-up access, but you also want VPN capability to be reserved for a smaller group, create an Active Directory group and put your VPN users in it. You can then create a policy using the 2 conditions outlined in the exercise, plus a condition that uses the Windows group attribute to specify the new group, as with ordinary VPN policy in exercise 8.4. So I'm going to leave it here today for this live stream. If you're listening, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you.